July 22, 2017, which means that we are exactly 30 days out from the big event on August 21, 2017, the total eclipse of the sun that is going to cross the United States from west to east, beginning in Oregon, visiting 14 states, and exiting from South Carolina out into the Atlantic Ocean. There has been a great deal of media coverage, many articles in newspapers, magazines, various books probably being written as well. But yet there are quite a few things about this eclipse that I'm sure you are not familiar with, or not just this eclipse, but eclipses in general. And the reason you're not familiar with it is the astronomers don't know anything about it, so they can't tell you. And there is another source, which is the Bible, and our good friends, the theologians, perhaps could tell us something, but they don't understand what's in the Bible either. And so the difficulty is we have to unite both of these things to see what the eclipse is really all about. Now, at this point, there are probably not a dozen people in this country that do not know that the eclipse is coming. There is going to be traffic, gridlock, mayhem, pandemonium, wherever the eclipse touches down. A lot of people that are flocking into small towns, medium-sized towns. But let's look at eclipses for just a moment to understand something basic about eclipses. And that is, there are two types of eclipses, two types of central eclipses, where the disk of the moon is going straight across the disk of the sun. There are two types. One is a total eclipse, where the moon is close enough to the earth that it completely blocks out the disk or the light from the sun, except for the corona around the sun. The second type of eclipse is what is known as an annular eclipse. Now, that is not to be confused with the word annual, meaning once a year, because there's no such thing as a once-a-year eclipse. Annular eclipse comes from the Latin word annulus, which means a ring, like a ring on your finger. And during an annular eclipse, the moon is a bit farther out from the earth, not close enough to completely block out the light from the sun, and the result, when the moon is central on the disk of the sun, there remains a O-ring of bright sunlight all around the moon. Now, the type of eclipse the astronomers like is the total eclipse, but the annular eclipses actually are more common than total eclipses. So we want to understand a few things about the moon. One of the things we need to understand is the unique relationship that the moon has to the sun. And this is something that you may not be aware of. However, the reason that the moon can neatly cover the disk of the sun and block out its light is very simple. And that is that the sun is 400 times greater in diameter than the moon. But the moon is 400 times closer to the earth. And therefore, the distance advantage of the moon cancels out the size advantage of the sun, and they appear to have the same size in the sky. You might be surprised just how small they look. Many people think they look maybe the size of a $50 or a quarter or a nickel, but actually they don't look that big. If you hold a 1/4-inch dried pea between your index finger and your thumb and hold it up to the sky against the disk of the sun, that 1/4-inch pea will very neatly cover either the disk of the sun or of the moon. So, as you know, we went to the moon 6 times, actually more than 6 times, but we landed on the moon 6 times from 1969 to 1972 in the Apollo lunar missions. They brought back hundreds of pounds of moon rocks to be examined in laboratories here on Earth. And one thing they very quickly discovered is that these moon rocks were all igneous in origin. Now, igneous, for those of you who did not have 2 years of Latin in high school, as I did, igneous comes from the Latin word ignis. Ignis means fire. And so these lunar rocks that were brought back were all igneous in origin, which is to say they were all molten at some point in the not terribly distant past. And the astronomers, on the basis of careful examination by geologists of these moon rocks, have concluded that the moon, at some point in, again, the not too distant past, was one vast magma ocean. From pole to pole, a mass of magma. Now, if the moon was that hot and melted, then it was giving off its own light and heat. And obviously the moon is not doing that now. So something must have changed. Something very serious changed. And it is this. In Genesis chapter 1, on the 4th day of creation, it says God made 2 great lights, one to rule the day and one to rule the night. Now we have a tendency to read into that text our present day understanding and experience with the moon. So that we say, okay, yeah, the moon reflects the light of the sun. That's the great light that rules the night. Well, that is not what the text is talking about. When the text says 2 great lights, that's exactly what it means. And the origin, these lunar rocks, all igneous in origin, giving off their own heat and light, is an indication that the moon was a major light in and of itself at some point in the past. It did not need the light of the sun in order to produce light. But in the meantime, of course, the moon has gone out. Now, there are reasons why that occurred. We're not going to get into that 100% in this video. Just keep in mind that the moon gave off its own heat and light when it came fresh from the mind and hand of the infinite God. It was not the dead, burnt-out world that we all experience. Now, you might think, well, the moon, look at when it's full moon, shining up in the sky brightly. You could read a book by it down here on planet Earth. It's pretty bright. But that is not still what Genesis chapter 1 has in mind. The moon originally, according to Isaiah 30, verse 26, gave off as much light, it was as bright as the sun is now. And the sun was 7 times brighter than it is now. That doesn't mean 7 times hotter. It means 1.6 times hotter. But again, you might think that would be too hot down here. There are good explanations as to why that would not be too hot, but we're not going to get into those in this video. However, the moon, giving off its own heat and light at that point in time, was a reddish color. The sun is basically a yellow-white color, and the moon was a reddish color. So you could tell a very big difference between the two. Now, when we see a total eclipse of the sun at present, or an annular eclipse, we do not see the moon approaching the sun in the sky. We do not see a trace of the moon until the moon begins to encroach upon the disk of the sun and take a bite out of the sun, and then you will see a black area that gradually grows in size as the moon goes over the disk of the sun. Of course, that would not have been the case originally, because the moon, giving off its own heat and light, you would have seen it up in the sky as a reddish, round disk. Keep in mind, because it produced its own heat and light, there was no such thing as a crescent moon, a quarter moon, a half moon, a three-quarter moon, a full moon, as we now know it. It was always full and round and reddish and quite bright. And so as the moon would approach the sun, you would see this reddish disk coming over the yellow-white disk of the sun. So we have a little graphic or two here that illustrate the original relationship of the sun and the moon. This one on the left shows the sun and the moon as the same size. The moon a bit darker, there's no color here, and this is the way they look to us up in the sky. This other graphic, this line here, this arc of a circle, is part of the sun. The sheet is not big enough to draw the full size of the sun, but here is the moon right on the disk or the edge of the sun, showing the actual size, 1/400th the size of the sun. The astronomers never seem to cease oohing and awing over this remarkable relationship of the sun and the moon, that they appear the same size in the sky. In my book, Twin to the Sun, I present quite a few of these quotations, and they are remarkable quotations. The astronomers are intelligent people, and they write well, but they don't understand, in this case, what they're writing about, because they think that this 1:400 relationship is sheer coincidence, that there's no mind, there's no planning behind it at all, in their opinion. So with two lights up in the sky, two great lights, this graphic shows how the illumination of planet Earth would work through one entire lunar cycle. Here at the top we have new moon, where the sun and the moon are on the same side of planet Earth, and you have the darkest night of the month on the back side. 7.5 days later, the moon is above the Earth here, and the sun is out here. You have 4 levels of illumination. And after 15 days, the moon is behind the Earth, what we would now call full moon. But keep in mind, the moon was always full back then. And so you have 2 levels of illumination. Here, you have 4 levels of illumination, like the second segment here. And finally, down at the bottom, you're back to the 2 levels of illumination that you have at new moon. The 1:400 relationship is a relationship that needs to be understood for what it is and not underestimated. It is an extremely important and significant relationship, and we cannot just dismiss it as coincidence. The astronomers are very good at most of what they do. They have a couple of areas that are very problematic for them, however. One is the area of origins. How did all of this get here? How did our solar system get here? Did it evolve over 5.5 billion years of time, as the astronomers would have us believe? Or is the Bible correct, that it was created in a short period of time by somebody who had the intelligence and the power to get the job done quickly? The idea that it evolved over a long period of time, we can trace back to a Frenchman by the name of Pierre Simon Laplace, who in 1795 gave the clearest up to that point elaboration of what is known as the nebular hypothesis, according to which the whole system evolved from a slowly rotating cloud of gas and dust, and over billions of years of time, the particles were attracted together by gravity, they bashed into each other, they stuck, the little balls that resulted grew in size, until finally we had the sun, we had the planets, etc. Now there is a problem with this scenario. There's a big problem, and that is when things bash into each other, they don't generally stick. If you want an example of that, go out and look at the satellite system of Saturn. You might think those rings, beautiful as they are something that were intended. That's not the case. The astronomers know that those rings are formed by two of the satellites of Saturn that left, for whatever reason, their proper orbital paths and were pulled down closer to Saturn, where the gravity of Saturn overcame the gravity that held these satellites together, and they basically exploded, and the pieces have been bumping and grinding into each other ever since. We have another example of this out in the asteroid belt, where there used to be a planet between Mars and Jupiter, but it is no longer there. We had an event a few thousand years ago that I call the solar system catastrophe. You're probably not familiar with that, but you'll find it in Genesis, known as Noah's flood. Noah's flood was a much bigger event than we give it credit for being. That Noah's flood actually was a solar system-wide catastrophe. Some of you who are a bit older may remember a TV sitcom by the name of Third Rock from the Sun. And the idea there is Mercury is the first rock, Venus is the second rock, Earth is the third rock. Well, there's a problem with that idea, and it is this, that we have some missing real estate in the solar system. There are two planets missing between the Sun and Mercury, so Mercury is not the first planet, it's the third planet. There's a planet missing between Mercury and Venus, so Venus is not the second planet, it's the fifth planet. The moon, as we're going to demonstrate a bit later, is the junior member, if you please, of a double or a binary planetary system. In other words, the moon and Earth constitute a double planet system. And the moon is the sixth planet from the sun, the Earth is the seventh planet, Mars is the eighth, and the asteroid belt, what is left out there, is the remains of what used to be the ninth planet from the sun. Now, every time that you're outside at night and you see a shooting star blaze across the sky, you are seeing a remnant of one of these missing planets that has entered Earth's atmosphere. We have tons of this stuff that rains down on Earth every single day, most of it reaching the Earth in the form of very fine dust. Now, we want to consider what we hear from the astronomers about certain aspects of astronomy. As I indicated, there are two real problem areas. One is origins, the other is the destiny of our solar system, of the galaxy, the universe, etc. In both of these areas, they are highly speculative. In fact, we would have to characterize what they have to say in these areas as nothing more than BS, and plenty of it, and it stinks to high heaven. And to be friendly to the astronomers, we will label this BS as bogus science, bad science, bum science, bozo science, blockhead science. Indeed, it's no science at all. But we are all familiar with the other idea of BS, which is what comes out of the south end of a large male buffalo facing north. And that certainly is appropriate here as well. We must not let the astronomers BS us, nor must we let the astronomers buffalo us. We can't let them fool us or confuse us with some of their less than logical ideas that are not supported by facts, but are merely hypotheses. The moon and the Earth originally had a certain distance between them. The distance was 30 Earth diameters between the center of the Earth and the center of the moon. In astronomy, distances are measured from center to center, not from surface to surface. Now, it's rather interesting that it was 30 Earths between the Earth and the moon, and that the original month described in the Bible is 30 days in length. 30 diameters, 30 days. Coincidence? Well, if you believe in coincidences that strongly, then perhaps, but I don't regard that as a coincidence. You see this piece of black velvet here, which I almost forgot to comment on that. Black velvet is not what we would regard as the most reflective surface. If we shine a light on it, we can see that it will reflect a little light. Something white, like the whiteboard, definitely, in contrast to the black velvet, reflects a great deal more light. If we have a mirror, that's going to reflect more light still. And the amount of light that a planet reflects back into space that it receives from the sun is known as the albedo. That comes from a Latin word that basically means white. So albedo is talking about the whiteness of a planet in terms of how much light it reflects that it receives from the sun. The planet Venus, for example, reflects back into space 70% of the light from the sun that it receives. Therefore, it has an albedo of 70. Earth reflects about 35 to 40% of the light it receives back into space. The moon is a rather interesting case here. It looks bright up in the sky, especially at full moon, but actually the moon is one of the darkest, least reflective objects in the solar system. What Genesis chapter 1 is talking about, when it says two great lights, it is not talking about one great light and one extremely low-grade, inefficient, poor quality reflector. The albedo of the moon is 7%. Some parts of the moon are a bit brighter, some are a bit dimmer, but on average 7% of the light that the moon receives from the sun, it reflects back out into space. And that's what we see when we see the moon up in the sky. We're looking at that 7%. The reason the moon looks so bright at night, especially at full moon, is because the moon is relatively close to us, under 250,000 miles away, and we see it against a very dark background, a black background. That makes it look bright. Now this black velvet, though it's not very reflective, it does reflect some light. You might be interested to know that black velvet reflects 7% of the light that hits it. So the moon has the reflective characteristics of a piece of black velvet. It's like a very dark rock. It reflects very little light at all. And again, that does not answer the description of two great lights in Genesis chapter 1. Nor does it answer the description of Isaiah 30:26, where we are told that in the recreation that the moon will be as bright as the sun, and the sun will shine with the light of 7 days. So keep in mind, the moon originally was not this dim, invisible object at eclipses that we now have in the sky, but rather it was an object that you could see big and round and red approaching the sun.